I'm Scott Slovic from the University of Idaho, and I'll be the moderator for today's one-hour event featuring Jenny Irons from the William T. Grant Foundation and Alicia Sasser-Modestino from Northeastern University. This is the 16th webinar in our series of presentations for researchers, research administrators, and others who are interested in what we call highly integrative, basic, and responsive research. Our previous webinars are now available for viewing on the HRA website, which can be found at hibar-research.org. A recording of today's webinar will soon be posted on the HRA website as well. Now let me explain the structure of today's meeting. We'll begin, as we always begin our webinars, with a brief overview of the HIBAR research concept by Lauren Whitehead. Jenny and Alicia will then speak for 20 to 25 minutes about the WT Grant Foundation's Institutional Challenge Grant Program, which encourages research institutions to remove barriers that inhibit collaborative work, and about Alicia's project supported by this program, which has developed a lasting partnership with the City of Boston's Department of Youth Engagement and Employment. And we'll then have approximately 20 minutes for Q&A, followed by a final opportunity for our presenters to offer a few takeaway messages. Now let's get started. Dr. Lauren Whitehead, the director of the HRA, is a professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at the University of British Columbia. He'll briefly introduce the concept of HIBAR research and the HRA organization. Lauren?
Well, I'll be very brief today, but it's a pleasure to have a chance just to provide kind of an overview concept on the HIBAR Research Alliance and HIBAR research. I'll begin by just talking about HIBAR research in general and make it, and it actually is a fairly simple idea, but it does include a few ideas that have to be thought about simultaneously. So a diagram is kind of helpful. We say that HIBAR research itself and the projects that are comprised by the idea of HIBAR research have four basic simultaneous ideas in the form of two key dualities. So every HIBAR research project has, first of all, the first duality, integrating academic leadership and societal leadership. And these are the people who are involved in making the decisions about how the research takes place. Secondly, there's integration of academic purpose and societal purpose. And so it's the simultaneity of those four ideas that is critical. And by the way, I'll just add that the word HIBAR that we use to describe this research came from a bunch of people getting together in meetings and talking about the fact that the characteristic of these four ideas is being simultaneous, could be described as highly integrative. And the idea that they're both academic and also very involved with application in a way, that synergy can be described by the words basic and responsive. So it was those words that led to the acronym HIBAR, which is really just a label, but it's a label for what we think is an important idea about simultaneity of intent and action. So HIBAR research projects are at the focal point of these four different, very powerful lenses. And it's their simultaneity that we believe leads to HIBAR research being so productive and so impactful. Now, the fact that it's a narrow definition is important. That's why we put a bit of effort into mentioning that it is indeed narrow. And the reason is that makes it possible to emphasize it more. It's very impactful work, and we believe it's possible for society to do more of it. And that's the purpose of the HIBAR Research Alliance, is to try to make that happen. So the HRA itself is a distributed, organized network of experienced volunteers, expert volunteers, who are united in their support of this idea of HIBAR research projects. We together aim to increase the rate of HIBAR research projects in the university system from about 1 project in 20 at universities today to about 1 in 5 by approximately 2030, while also improving the quality of research of this type. This will help universities respond more effectively to societal needs while increasing the overall quality and diversity of the research portfolio. Now, today, it's a very exciting day for us to have the presentation on an exciting initiative of the William T. Grant Foundation. entitled the Institutional Institutional Challenges Grant Program. It focuses on building capacity to enable impactful HIBAR projects. Specifically, the program supports deeply collaborative cross-sectoral leadership teams, which are essential for this work, yet are often so difficult to build and sustain for the duration required for success of these projects. And an especially interesting aspect of this funding program is its dual nature. It funds important activities that will lead to better youth outcomes. And in addition to that, it builds capacity within research institutions to carry out subsequent HIBAR projects that can address additional societal needs. Well, I'm really excited about that activity in general, and so happy that we can hear about it today. So, Scott, I think I'll just wrap up there on that note and hand back to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Lauren. And now I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters. Jenny Irons is a senior program officer at the William T. Grant Foundation, where she leads the Institutional Challenge Grant Program and the Major Grants Funding Initiative to support research on reducing inequality among youth. And Alicia Sasser-Modestino is an associate professor with appointments in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs and the Department of Economics at Northeastern University, where she also serves as the research director of the Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy. Jenny and Alicia, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm delighted to represent the William T. Grant Foundation, and even more delighted to be presenting alongside Alicia Modestino, who doesn't only just have an institutional challenge grant, she's had multiple grants from the foundation. So you can ask her almost any question about what it's like to be a grantee in our different programs and get good information. I do want to start by saying that I have been leading the Institutional Challenge Grant Program since October of 2022. So this is actually my first presentation on this program. I'm happy to be here, and I look forward to telling you about our work and answering your questions. I do want to start by talking about the Foundation's two overarching focus areas for a couple of reasons. One, because any research we fund has to fit within one of these two focus areas, but also because the Institutional Challenge Grant Program is really a merger representing our interest in these two focus areas. Our Reducing Inequality focus area was launched in 2014. And the key feature of this initiative is its focus on responses to inequality, not its causes or consequences. In this research area, we support studies that help us understand how programs, policies, and practices can improve outcomes and address inequality among young people in the United States, and is a key component of the Institutional Challenge Grant Program. Our Use of Research Evidence initiative was launched in 2008 and refocused in 2015, and supports studies that identify the conditions that improve the production and use of research evidence in ways that benefit youth. Importantly, the Institutional Challenge Grant Program brings together these two focus areas. It facilitates research that yields knowledge that is useful to decision makers, and research that is used in ways to improve youth outcomes. At the William T. Grant Foundation, we believe public and private universities have a critical role to play in not only producing high-quality research, but also in supporting research that solves pressing societal problems. We also believe, based on research we funded over the years, that university and community partnerships have the potential to make this sort of difference. The Institutional Challenge Grant was designed to bridge the gap between research produced and research being used, and has four major goals. And I'll talk in a little bit more detail about each of these goals and make sure I save time for talking about the application process itself. The first goal of this grant is to support research institutions in building a sustained partnership with a public agency or nonprofit organization. The research practice partnership should have defined objectives, roles, and agreements, and should be built for the long term. So this isn't just about funding one-off projects, but about long-term institutional commitments with joint research agendas that are mutually defined and mutually beneficial. The second major goal of this grant is that together the partnership will pursue a joint research agenda to reduce inequality and youth outcomes. And I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about the specific interest the foundation has in this area. The third goal is this goal of institutional change. And as part of this goal, what we ask of our applicants is that the research institution commits to a feasible strategy for institutional change that can address the structural, motivational, and/or financial barriers that often inhibit research practice partnerships. We ask that the grant establish structural supports and incentives that will encourage skilled mid-career researchers to conduct joint work with policymakers and practitioners, and an environment in which partnerships can thrive. The final goal of this grant is to, on the research design, give researchers new experiences that foster deeper understandings of a given policy or practice context, and the skills required to serve as effective partners. And at the same time, we seek the grant to build the capacity of the public agency or nonprofit to understand, conduct, and use research through activities such as technical assistance, infrastructure improvements, or staff training. This is an ambitious challenge. It's a lot of work, but we believe it's what's needed to produce and use relevant research in ways that improve youth outcomes. I'm probably going to do this fairly quickly, but I want to say just a little bit more about each of these goals and maybe give you a couple of examples to give you a sense of the kind of work we're funding. And of course, in Alicia's presentation, she'll give you very concrete strategies that she's pursuing at Northeastern University and with her partner to carry out this work. So as I said earlier, this is about funding work that is really about building a sustained and collaborative partnership over time. A growing body of work and research in this area suggests that partnerships can help researchers develop an understanding of a local context, learn about the needs and questions of policymakers and practitioners, and provide insights that can lead to groundbreaking research. Research practice partnerships can benefit a public agency or nonprofit organization. They can help policymakers and practitioners gain access to existing research in ways they might not otherwise be able to do, build a research agenda, and receive assistance in their efforts to improve youth outcomes. So the second major goal of this grant is to support the research practice partnership to develop a research agenda. And this is important because in fitting with our interest in reducing inequality, because we have a very strategic idea about what we want researchers to focus on in terms of addressing some of the most pressing forms of inequality in the United States. And I do want to back up and say that as a foundation, our main interest is in funding research that improves outcomes for youth ages 5 to 25 in the United States. And we are committed to funding research that identifies ways to improve youth outcomes and to address inequality on the basis of economic standing, racial and ethnic identity, and immigrant origin status. So our partnerships work together to identify research agendas that can do this. And Alicia will talk about the work she's conducting with the mayor's office in Boston. But another example of work we're funding is a partnership between the University of California, Berkeley and the San Francisco United School District to address chronic absenteeism in their schools. And what they're doing is promoting the use of youth participatory action research by the San Francisco United School District. So the Berkeley side is working collaboratively with the San Francisco United School District to use administrative data to understand the scope of the problem, but they're also bringing in youth voice by demonstrating the ways in which centering youth in research can provide new and unexpected perspectives, for example, on chronic absenteeism and ways to address that. So let me say a little bit now about institutional change. As probably most of you on this webinar know, there are often pretty significant policies and practices within higher ed institutions that can inadvertently create barriers to the success of long-term partnerships. And so what this grant does is it asks research institutions to commit to identifying ways to address those barriers. And we do ask that applicants be very specific about the barriers that are unique to their setting and the ways in which the grant will enable them to address those barriers. So with the institutional challenge grant, institutions are challenged to examine and redesign their policies and practices in ways that can incentivize research, in ways that encourage sustained collaboration with partnerships, in ways that incentivize particularly exceptional researchers like Alicia to initiate and sustain relevant research agendas that are mutually beneficial for their partners, and in ways that improve the partnership skills of researchers. In short, our hope is that this program catalyzes institutional change to better value research practice partnerships in their work. Now, one thing I will note is that a number of our grantees, when they apply, they're applying to really change the policies and practices in their particular school. So, for example, in a school of education or in the School of Public Policy. But what we're hoping will happen is that by really targeting change in a particular area of the university and demonstrating how effective that can be, we start to see those commitments diffuse across universities and also diffuse, hopefully, across other institutions as well. This is a slide that gives you some examples of different kinds of institutional change that our grantees are engaging in. I think often what comes to mind when we talk about institutional change to incentivize this sort of research is people think about shifting tenure and promotion policies and practices, and certainly that is what some of our grantees are doing. But there are other ways in which universities might demonstrate institutional change, and again, they may be particular to your particular environment. Let me talk briefly about the final component of this grant, and that is to build the capacity on both the research side and the partner side to produce useful research and to use research that can improve youth outcomes. So our grantees have done this in different ways to focus on building skills and capacity on both the partnership, the community partnership, and the university partner side. Sometimes this means strengthening data collection practices. It can mean creating leadership positions. So another one of our grantees in Boston is a partnership between Boston University and the local United Way. And the local United Way there has created leadership positions that are particularly focused on their issue area, which is addressing homelessness in Boston, but also on using research. So again, this is the kind of thing that will be particular to a partnership and will develop in collaboration between the university partner and the community partner. One thing I do want to mention about this grant, and I won't spend much time here, but I'm happy to answer questions about this in the Q&A, is that this grant requires that a university commit to mid-career fellows. And Alicia can talk a little bit about how this plays out in her particular grant. It varies by grantee, but it does support mid-career fellows who are 8 to 20 years out from their terminal degree in working with a project and leading the research plan and also collaborating with a community partner to carry out the work. The Institutional Challenge Grant has an initial term of 3 years of $650,000, and there's a possibility of a 2-year renewal. Our expectation is generally that all grantees will have 5 years of grant funding, but we do have that renewal application process. This does really importantly, and this is something that distinguishes this award, includes a 9-month planning period and also requires an institutional match from the university in support of the mid-career fellows. Our hope is at the end of 5 years that universities have an established set of strategies to facilitate sustained partnerships and to support researchers in doing this work. Applications are always due in September. That date varies by the year and are reviewed by members of our selection committee after an internal screening process. And if you're interested in seeing who members of our selection committee are, you can find that on our website. We are actually at the latter stages of our review process this year, and we'll soon be bringing in 7 finalists for our grant competition this year. One of the wonderful things about this grant since we started it is that we've brought other foundations on board to help us support it. The Spencer Foundation and the Doris Duke Foundation have been generous and wonderful collaborative partners in funding this work. And this year, and I won't make the announcement quite yet, but we're thrilled to have an additional funder on board. So we think we'll be funding 4 partnerships this year. We funded 3 in the past several years. Our website provides a lot of resources for you. I will note, and perhaps Alicia can nod to this, it is an extensive application process. You want to give yourself plenty of time to work on it, and I look forward to answering any questions you have in the Q&A period.
Thank you, Jenny. Yeah, Alicia, your turn.
Awesome. I'll just pick right up where Jenny left off. So thanks, Jenny, for that introduction there of what the Institutional Challenge Grant is and sort of the broad brush of what it's trying to accomplish. I'm going to talk today about our specific project. that we got funded called Building a More Holistic and Inclusive Workforce Development System for Boston's Youth. This is joint work with my policy partner, Rashad Cope, who at the time was the Director of Youth Engagement and Employment, but now is the Deputy Director of the City of Boston's new Worker Empowerment Cabinet, which is one of the challenges of this kind of work, is that there's changes and turnovers and moving pieces, but always expecting the unexpected will help you navigate that. I think for me, when I framed this to my dean and to the provost about why we should be doing this, I needed to identify a clear need for this kind of work, especially if you're going to convince your institution to be doing that heavy cost share. And the way we framed it was thinking about the communities that we live and work in, right? So we know that cities and states in particular face these long-standing policy challenges. I just listed a few that I have worked in, but you could take this to any policy challenge that is in your backyard. And really need the expertise and the resources to find solutions. Even now, when there's a lot of ARPA dollars flowing around, it's not that they don't have enough money, it's that all that money is for doing, right? And not so much for thinking strategically about how best to spend those additional funds. And universities have that expertise, right, to design and implement these smart solutions, but a lot of times, you know, policy challenges are messy. They don't fit into one specific discipline. Often they certainly can't be solved in a semester or even an academic year or 2 or 3. And so we really need different structures for faculty to work collaboratively across areas and in real time with policymakers and communities, not on academic time, right? Some of the barriers to collaborating with external partners that we try to address with this grant, I think are really well captured in this policy solving roadmap that I kind of cribbed from the Scholar Strategy Network and adapted to my own purposes. But as you can see, you know, if you think you're going to just release some research as a journal article, you know, over here and poof, it becomes a policy change over there. There's a lot that's happening in between. And one of the major barriers that we've identified is that there's a lot that happens upfront before you can even go and apply for external funding, right? So you need to get the right people at the table. You need to gain trust. You need to co-develop an ethical relationship. So we're not talking about when academics fly in, extract data from a community, write a peer-reviewed article, write that one paragraph at the end of a policy recommendation and fly out. That does not help anybody. That is not an ethical relationship. Really learning about policy needs before you launch the project or even seek external funding. So listening, right, which is not always a fundamental academic skill. Recognizing that it's a sprint, sorry, not spring, it's a sprint and a marathon. So often, you know, funding is for research or implementation, but not both. That's often a challenge to try to leverage policy windows for change, right? So the most effective time when we can actually put research evidence into use is when things are actually changing on the ground. And it's not always the case that, you know, the resources are going to be well aligned. And then finally, expecting the unexpected, right? So social science is messy. You don't always find the kinds of results that your policy partner is hoping for. And what do you do when that happens? Or, you know, your policy partners can turn over frequently, right? Which can limit the capacity for change. So one of the ways that we framed doing research practice partnership work for our university was to think about it as an engage, think, and do model, right? So first engaging in these long-term mutually beneficial partnerships with external stakeholders, collaborating so that we think, we co-create not just the research agenda and the questions, but how are we going to collect data? How are we going to do the analysis? And then iterating with that policy partner to think about how to co-design and implement solutions based on the research findings. So there's many times that I bring research findings to City of Boston. I think I've had an aha moment and they explain, oh, that's because the project or the program works this way, right? I would have completely come to the wrong conclusion, right? And be looking to move these policy levers that really weren't at play had I not been co-creating, right, this research all the way along. And then we don't just, you know, offer a solution and say, see you later. We actually evaluate that policy solution. And then we go back around again, right? So that's what it means to be in this mutually beneficial long-term partnership, because we know that these are not simple and easy solutions. It's not like you're in the lab and you have one aha moment and that's going to create societal change. So a good example of this is the work that we've been doing with City of Boston around their summer youth employment program. This work actually started back in 2015, 2016 with research to really co-create that data analysis and analyze the policy problem. And that research showed that the summer youth employment program reduces violent crime by 30%, increases high school graduation by 5 percentage points, and also leads to greater employment and wages down the road, particularly for Black and Brown youth. Then the pandemic hit, and many other cities closed down their summer youth employment program. So New York City initially canceled their program, leaving 75,000 young people unemployed during summer 2020, when youth unemployment was 30%. And there were not very many activities for young people to be doing. It was Black Lives Matter. There was a lot going on during that summer. So our policy partner came to us and said, help us design, some new tracks of programming, because the usual summer jobs were not available. Day camps and daycares were not running. Lots of employers were not taking young people. And so we came up with a virtual internship program that our private sector employers could use. We came up with a Learn and Earn summer program where we paid students to be able to take community college courses during the summer, and paid them not just for the course, but also for their time spent taking the course. So they didn't have that trade-off between having to have a job versus having a post-secondary experience, because our research had showed that half of our young people pay some kind of household bill with their summer jobs earnings. And so this was a huge cash transfer program. And we took all of that research evidence and those 4 new tracks of programming, brought it to Mayor Walsh at the time, and he invested $4 million of CARES Act funding that summer to commit to hiring the same number of youth at the same rate of pay for the same number of hours. And then Secretary of Labor, or Mayor Walsh, became Secretary of Labor Walsh and started hanging out with Joe Biden, who then cited our research and everything that was happening in Boston around the Summer Youth Employment Program, and urged other cities to be using their CARES Act and ARPA funding as a way to engage youth and provide meaningful job opportunities and combat youth violence. And now that work is ongoing in a new partnership that's being funded by the Institutional Challenge Grant, where we've just spent a planning year with our policy partner to look under the hood at the Summer Youth Employment Program and now move the needle on what that program does. If you're wondering, what do these things look like in terms of how they're structured, here's what our partnership looks like. So Rashad and I are the principal investigators, and we are 50-50. We are partners. We meet every 2 weeks, and we push the work forward together. The way this was structured, even financially, half of the funding is going to City of Boston. Okay, so that cost share was a huge factor, being able to provide capacity on the city side, and also to meet the ethical criteria that we had for funding. So often, it's the case as academics, we go off and we get funding to do the research, and we leave the policy partner to figure out how to fund the things on their side. That does not feel ethical to us in terms of how we operate. So we very much appreciate that the Institutional Challenge Grant makes that very explicit, that cost share. And then we have a set of mid-career fellows. Mindy Marks is an economist at Northeastern, who is our faculty that we've engaged. We also have a postdoctoral fellow, Hannah Hoover. And then on the city side, part of this funding pays for a policy fellow who is able to expand that capacity for DYEE to not only make use of research evidence, but also engage in some of their own research to push forward questions that they're thinking about. We even hosted a training for not just City of Boston, but all of the key intermediaries in the summer youth employment ecosystem in Boston, to help them understand the use of research evidence and also start designing their own research projects in terms of the questions that they want to ask and answer. And then Naaman McDaniels, who is essential to everything we do as someone who's deeply engaged in the day-to-day at City of Boston. And then down here, I call these shared key staff, because really we're not just keeping this on the university side or the city side, but we worked very closely with this planning consultant, Peter Blakely, to be able to do our planning in our first year. And we wrote a report for Mayor Wu that has now led to City of Boston adopting changes to their summer youth employment program in terms of where it sits in the city structure. So now Rashad has taken that with him into the worker empowerment cabinet, elevated that work, and Boston will be investing an extra $1 million in a new jobs platform that will better help to match young people to jobs based on the research that we had shown, and where the city really had been leaving about 300 or so, upwards of 500 during the pandemic, jobs unfilled, right? That was money left on the table due to the inefficient system they had been using, as well as some equity questions that we raised in terms of the distribution of young people who applied versus the distribution of young people who get placed. And so we helped develop a job matching algorithm for them that helps to ensure that there's equity in those placements. And that is what they will be adopting this coming summer. And then also it funded 2 PhD students, one of which, Abby, actually got hired by City of Boston. And by hired, I mean like for $1, where we paid her salary, but she was really a shared resource with City of Boston to provide some additional boots on the ground as we were working to hire the policy fellow. And so I think that's really a key component of this structure. Now on the institutional change side, right? So that's on the research side. On the institutional change side, the goal is really, how do we institutionalize this kind of infrastructure across the university, right? So the Institutional Challenge Grant was like a breath of fresh air for me as a researcher to finally have the resources to be able to engage in the partnership in a very structured way, to make sure that my policy partner had the resources that they need. And so we had 3 sort of main goals when we set this up. One was to increase coordination, to be able to promote knowledge transfer, to collaborate on larger projects. Northeastern's also known for 2 things. One is a co-op program for our undergraduates, where our undergraduates spend 6 months full-time working for an employer. And that's where the employers are paying the private sector wages. Wouldn't that be great to do in the public sector, but not have the public sector be on the hook for those wages, right? So that was a piece of this. And also Northeastern has been adopting new global campus locations. We bought Mills College out in Oakland last year. We now have 14 campus locations. So to be able to do this kind of work across all of our global campus locations. The second was to expand the capacity for faculty to be able to do this. And so this coincided actually with our provost adopting a new academic plan where the goal was to create societal impact and to encourage community engaged research. There's a lot of faculty at Northeastern who have been doing this kind of work for years. They do it very well. There's a lot of faculty who were community engaged curious, I guess I would call them. And there's real risks if we're not going to put guardrails and support faculty who are interested in doing this kind of work. And so that's where we aim to provide training and coaching, to also fund seed grants and course releases, because this kind of work takes time and it takes some resources up front before you can even go out and look for external funding, and also help developing and maintaining those external partnerships for faculty who have not done this work before, and implementing guidelines for ethical engagement, which was a key component for us to think about everything from how you develop that relationship, as well as how you seek that external funding. And then finally, establishing the right incentives, right? So promoting these policy impacts really elevates this work within the university. Requiring multidisciplinary collaboration for internal grants also fosters this kind of work. Looking for faculty who actually have research partnership experience. And so last year I led a search for 2, and I found 3 amazing faculty members now in the School of Public Policy who do this kind of research practice partnership work. And so we're able to elevate that status. And then we haven't quite gotten there yet, but at least for the merit criteria, this kind of work is something that gets recognized. It's not quite there for tenure and promotion, but that is on the list of things to do. So the key thing that we've done at Northeastern to institutionalize this is by forming a new initiative called City to City. And this is a university-wide initiative funded by the Provost Office to the tune of $4 million over the next 3 years, where we will take this kind of impactful community engaged research that we've done in Boston in the backyard, and we will bring it to all of our global campus locations. And so we will start in Oakland this year. And it's structured where we have 2 leadership directors. At the present, it's myself in Boston and a co-PI in Oakland that we will be leading this initiative. And then we have these other three internal constituencies. One is what we call these important resource and network contributors. These are folks who have internal training for how to do community engaged research, scholars inside our institution who have developed ethical guidelines for us to be following, and others who just are engaged in partnership development, right? So think about your community engagement kinds of offices. We also have over here distinguished advisors. So these are individuals who are in our School of Law. I won't call them older, but I will call them wiser. And these are folks who might have the title emeritus or distinguished in their academic title, who really make sure that we stay true to our intent. And we have the North Star of equity, because we can get really excited as academics about particular projects and not realize the harm that we might be doing. And so that is my group who's going to make sure that we stay true to our ideals. And down here, we have our multidisciplinary key content collaborators. This is rank and file faculty who have expertise in a particular area: housing, transportation, engineering, whatever it might be, so that when we bring in a project that needs a kind of expertise, there's already a willing constituency who wants to be a part of that project, to do something, engage with the community, and we can bring them in at a time that is appropriate. And so what we're really looking to do is to build that gap between faculty and external partners. We have a couple key initiatives we're already developing for faculty. There's a seed grant that provides a little bit of money to develop that relationship, whatever they might need, some training, some mentorship, connecting them to external partners. Then they can become a policy fellow. So from those seed grant winners, we choose 2 each year who will get a course release and some summer support. So more time to be able to build this, have access to some of our other staff, our research staff, to be able to do this, and have help with travel and research expenses. And then by year 3, we provide this infrastructure for the Center for Public Policy Innovation and Practice that will sit over all of our global campus locations. And then for policymakers and practitioners, there's a no wrong door. So we have a website we're developing where they can pitch a project. It might be a project that's ready to get connected to a faculty member with particular expertise. Great. They might need some support to develop that research practice partnership that we will provide. It might be a smaller project. A lot of these institutions or organizations just need some boots on the ground to do a little bit of data analysis or help them think through one particular aspect of the work that we do. And that's where we can provide them with a co-op student, a capstone group of students, or a PhD student under the guidance of faculty. And then we will also have an executive education program similar to what we did last year for the summer youth employment ecosystem, to be able to provide them with some training about why is it useful to create research evidence, and how do we do this? And then we're going to take this initiative to scale, as I mentioned. So we'll move to 2 global campus locations each year, and that will help us make sure that we are working on the ground in the local context. So we think at Northeastern, that's a little bit of a unique kind of context for us, where we actually live and work in each of these locations. And so we have, for example, out in Oakland, faculty who have worked with policymakers in Oakland for decades already and have that established trust. And then the last thing that I'll just mention is, what's in it for the provost? So I'll just be upfront and say, I convinced the provost, based on the track record of having gotten the institutional challenge grant, that, if you put in the seed money to do this right and develop these longstanding relationships, then we are very well poised to go out and get external funding to support these kinds of projects, in addition to the societal impact that you will have in developing trust in each of these global campus locations. So I'll just stop there so that we can get to the Q&A and have a fruitful discussion.
Thank you very much, both of you, for these exciting presentations. And it's really fascinating to see how much momentum has been building with this program at Northeastern, thanks to the catalyzing funding that came from the WT Grant Foundation. So very interesting. I see that some questions are already beginning to form in the Q&A box. So let me turn to that. So here's a question for Jenny. Why has the WT Grant Foundation chosen to focus the program on mid-career faculty members? And is this a particularly influential group for catalyzing institutional change, or are there other reasons for the focus on this group?
So as the grant was originally envisioned, and there are different constellations now, but as originally envisioned, the PI, the intention was it would be someone who was in the position of leadership to drive institutional change, and that would be their primary responsibility. And then the person who served as the mid-career fellow, or the persons who serve as a mid-career fellow, would really be leading the research project. These are often pretty big research projects, and so the mid-career fellow is a designation in part because there's recognition that to be able to lead a project of this magnitude, that it needs to be someone who has significant skills and experience in conducting and leading big research projects. And so there's that component of it. There's also the component that acknowledges, when you're talking about someone who's 8 years post-PhD, they often have tenure. And we're operating in a university system that still doesn't always incentivize this kind of research. And so people who have tenure are often positions that are fairly safe. And that may change over time, but the president of our foundation believes that, this work should primarily be done by folks who are post-tenure because of the experiences they have. But again, the kind of structure varies across grants. I know Alicia's involved in the research at Northeastern, and there are other cases where the PI is not necessarily a dean, but often is, or not necessarily in the kind of position of leadership that Alicia is. And Alicia also, you can see, is bringing in a postdoctoral researcher to the work. And so it doesn't mean that the only researchers are at that mid-career level, but they're really seen as sort of the people who are often most primed to manage a research project of this capacity and ready to move onto the next stage of their career where they can really develop their capacity to engage in this partnership work.
Thank you. And actually, I have a few other questions specifically related to developing capacity among researchers. One is this idea that you mentioned, Alicia, about the importance of building trust among partners, which requires certain skills and experience that many faculty members may not ordinarily have had the opportunity to develop as part of their research training. So I wonder if you're aware of any resources that faculty members have access to for developing these trust building skills. And another of our attendees is asking if you can say more about training and coaching for faculty that you mentioned under the expanding capacity for institutional change idea. What exactly is this kind of training and coaching, and who would provide it?
Yeah, I think that's a really important component of this, and kind of ties in a little bit with what Jenny was just talking about. So one of the things that we've been doing at Northeastern, and it probably happens in other places as well, is forming these multi-generational research teams, if you will, and not just the research fellow and a postdoc and a graduate student, but also now that we're expanding this with the funding we have from the provost to also include assistant professors, right? So if they're part of this as part of a multi-generational team, or they're not having to lead the entire research effort, right? Then they can see what this looks like upfront, be part of this kind of research, but they're not holding the entire relationship themselves. They're not holding it together themselves. They're just part of this, but they can get that experience and see how it works in practice, which also helps them in terms of the amount of time that they would put into it, right? So it's something they can do on the tenure track if they're paired with a senior researcher. So that's one of the things that we're doing. Another thing is we've been using both internal as well as external resources for training. So externally, we've been using the Scholar Strategy Network training, which has been very useful in terms of thinking about how to even approach policymakers, how do you talk to policymakers, some of the really obvious things, but I've learned in working with faculty that somehow it doesn't occur to them, like this is not your policy partner's primary job to give you data. And so you actually really need to make it easy for them to be able to do this. You need to be aware of the time pressures that they're on. I don't ask for Rashad anything in the month of January because that is budget season, right? And he's got a lot on his plate. And actually it's the reverse. He might say, Alicia, I need a memo for Mayor Wu. This is what happened last year. That outlines all the things that you just showed us in your research to advocate for that new jobs platform, right? And so it's being responsive. Also understanding, when you write an email, put 3 things in it, bullets, anything that makes it easier to read. So all those kind of key tips. There's also internally, we have a training called Runway to Broader Impacts that's funded by the National Science Foundation. And I know William T. Grant is partnering with NSF to be broadening this lens here, where the National Science Foundation is really no longer just funding pure science. It's pure science that's use inspired and has to show a societal impact. And so this training is actually bringing in faculty from engineering, from the College of Science, to be thinking about the societal impacts by actually talking to people. It's a wild idea. So there are a lot of resources, but I do think a key part of this is that there has to be coaching. You can't just give someone a training and then leave them on their own, because there's lots of pitfalls. There's lots of things that change and moving parts with this work that really comes from just the experience. And so that's why SSN, Scholar Strategy Network, now has a coaching component to it. So we're going to have them coach our policy fellows, but also, again, that multi-generational team to have an experienced researcher working alongside with a junior researcher to really coach them through how these interactions look, I think is key.
And back to the specific idea of the types of relationships that need to exist between academic partners and community partners, the special skills that might not normally fall in the category of research, such as how to build trust, how to show that you're, I guess, working with the partner over the long run, not just, as you suggested, kind of flying in and then flying out again. How does an institution provide training in some of these kind of human relationship skills that might enable such a partnership to really succeed?
There's 2 key components. One is to recognize this is not for everybody. Okay, just like when you look at a department and you look at faculty mentoring students, not everyone's got great mentorship skills, and they're not often able to develop those to the extent that we need to be able to help students, right? And so those faculty, serve their institutions in other ways. And just like we have a spectrum of researchers, some of which who are very good at this work, some of which who are able to develop skills to become good at this work, and others who are going to stay in the pure science category, and that's awesome. That is completely fine. So I think that's one thing to recognize. The second is that you have to give people time. And that's where that time with the course release and the summer stipend comes after you give them a little bit of seed funding to try to get this going. I think a key piece of this is really demonstrating your value as an academic. So I always endeavor to provide some data and analysis back to my partner, like, hey, share some data with me, and I'm going to tell you like 3 key facts maybe you didn't know about it that could be useful to you in the thing that you do. And then that starts that reciprocal relationship, but giving people then additional time and resources to be able to do that iterative process. I mean, think a little bit like, the CBO to some degree, right? In terms of how responsive they are to Congress's needs, right? Congress writes this law, they need someone to do the analysis. There's a back and forth when things are revised. This is not like have one meeting at the beginning, one at the middle, one at the end. This is really partnering in real time, like, meeting every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks, or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm. Actually, you mentioned seed grants, and we do have a question in the Q&A box specifically about seed grants. And you mentioned, I think, Alicia, that in your program you have seed grants of about $5,000. And so there's a question about what is an appropriate size for a seed grant, and what kinds of costs and activities they generally support.
Yeah, so this seed grant is meant to be, funding over a semester, although, if people have unused money at the end of the semester, we're not going to claw it back or anything. And we've found at Northeastern, we have a lot of seed grant programs, and that seems to be enough for either a faculty member, or it could be a graduate student, honestly. We do have a lot of graduate students who are very, very interested in this kind of work. It's just enough money to be able to either provide time in the form of a research assistant that you can pay hourly, or if you need to buy data from a particular vendor, or you need to pay for data to be produced for you, or if you need to run a quick survey, if you need to interview and provide incentives for people to talk to you, it seems to be just enough money, again, to get the partnership started, to dig in and actually understand the problems better by collecting a little bit of data, doing a little bit of analysis and bringing back to your policy partner, that then you can see, does this thing have legs? That's essentially what the seed grant is, right? To do enough work to see, does this thing have legs? Is it ready to move forward? And if it is, then, you know, they can apply for the policy fellow funding.
Thank you. Thank you. I have another question back for Jenny. And I realize you're relatively new to the Institutional Challenge Grant program, but you still have a bird's eye view of the program and the types of projects that you're looking to fund. And the question is whether you have a sense of whether these projects tend to be bottom-up change efforts from individual researchers, which are then pitched, as seems to be the case in Alicia's project, pitched to the provost and other academic leaders, you know, to move forward with an application, or whether these are top-down efforts that, you know, that senior administrators at the institutions are aware of your funding and funding from other foundations and turn to faculty members and other research leaders at their institutions and say, hey, you know, this is something that we might want to think about at our university. Do you have a sense of whether there's a trend for these to be top-down or bottom-up projects?
I don't have an exact answer for you in terms of numbers, but just thinking about our current grantees, it's largely driven by research interest and oftentimes by interests that are already responsive to a partnership that exists. So a lot of the grantees I can think about, like Alicia was already working with the city of Boston. The UC Berkeley team I mentioned was already working with the San Francisco United School District. You know, generally there is some partnership in existence. And so they know, have a sense of what kind of research needs to be addressed. And then I think there's a lot of work among a lot of these partners that goes into really figuring out how to work with administration and leadership to advance the work, and I think that some of our PIs find, especially when they're not currently in positions of leadership, that they're energized by the work that it requires to do this work at an institutional level, but also find that it requires a lot of time that they weren't necessarily planning to invest in. Alicia, I'm thinking about conversations with Emily in particular, there's a skill set of work you have to do. And I think of one example, and I believe this was the UC Berkeley case, where in their application, they expressed a commitment to institutional change, but the selection committee wanted to hear more specifics about, well, what really is Berkeley going to do? And so Emily took that back. She was a finalist at that stage, took that back to Berkeley and said, look, we need more of a commitment to get this grant. And that's when Berkeley was like, okay, this is what we'll do. And so in that case, it was also a catalyst to really push the leadership to do something that they weren't necessarily planning to do. So that's maybe a long answer to your question. It seems like in large part, it seems to be driven by faculty, but I don't think that that's always the case.
Yeah, actually, the partnerships in these projects are really quite multi-layered and complicated. It's not simply the academic partner
that's a great
and the
point.
community partner. It's also the foundation, and it's the internal partnerships within the universities of the senior administrative leadership and the researchers who have to also form a kind of collaborative effort. So well, we have about 4 minutes left until the top of the hour, and that's what I had promised earlier to leave you, Alicia and Jenny, to offer some final messages for our attendees.
Yeah, I was just going to riff off of what Jenny was even saying in terms of how these things actually get done and how do you actually make the institutional change. And I think it's a matter of finding out what are the levers inside your institution that you can push, right? So I very deliberately, when we got the Institutional Challenge Grant, went around and started presenting this to any of the external constituents that I thought would be able to help me advance this cause. And that's how I ran into the provost director of strategy. And he said, oh, this sounds just like the academic plan. You've got to pitch this to the provost. And I was like, amen, like get me an audience, right, with the provost. And then I think the other thing I would say is to expect a lot of managing up, right? So
Mhm.
our senior leadership really wanted to make societal impact. They still were thinking about finding the cure for cancer or the next AI thing, not so much like how do you fix the summer youth employment program. And so we had to really teach them what societal impact looks like when you're handling these big kinds of amorphous problems that are intractable, that aren't going to get easily solved. The third thing I'll say is that there's also a lot of other faculty inside the institution who are doing this work in different places, and you really need to build a coalition to bring them along with you. So we have our key content collaborators. We have our important resource providers. I don't want to ignore people inside my institution who are providing training, who are developing ethical guidelines. I don't want to ignore those distinguished advisors who are going to make sure that we stay true to our ideals. And then the last thing I'll say is I really think that the Institutional Challenge Grant is so important in the way it's blending the production of research with making use of research evidence, right? So it's really taking, as Jenny was saying, those two components and putting them together in this integrative way, you know, that's probably very attractive in terms of a HIBAR kind of approach, where I think we're learning a lot about how to do these research practice partnerships, because we're inside one while we're studying it and trying to get other people to do it. And so I just think that it's a really amazing opportunity to be able to blend those two things together.
Thank you. Thank you. Jenny?
The only thing I'll say from the foundation side is that if you are interested in applying for one of these grants, you want to give yourself plenty of time. I'm sure Alicia can attest to the fact that it's an intense application process. All 4 of those goals are equally weighted and important. So you have to be able to demonstrate a strong research agenda and institutional commitment, and that you have a real partnership, because the selection committee is quite discerning and often can tell when that one, a community partner perhaps hasn't been fully engaged by the research institution. So it really is important to be thoughtful and intentional about putting these applications together. And another thing I'll just add is that there are often cases where if at first you don't succeed, you want to try again. So sometimes it's important, for the Institutional Challenge Grant Program, or really any grant program, to be persistent and to take feedback in mind and continue pushing forward with the work that you want to do.
Thank you. Is there any particular coaching available for people who are considering an application? Can they come to the WT Grant Foundation and get some advice or at the early stages?
Sure, they should email me at jirons@wtgrantfdn.org. Happy to talk with anyone who's interested in the application process. And I will also to echo what Alicia said about the coaching for thinking about building relationships and capacity building. The Scholar Strategy Network is a great organization at doing this. If you don't have a chapter at your campus, identify a local chapter or reach out to them about starting a chapter on your campus to support that work.
Yeah. Well, Jenny and Alicia, thank you so much for these excellent presentations and very thoughtful feedback. And thanks to everyone who's attended today's webinar. And I urge you to stay tuned for future announcements for events in this series. Thanks, everyone.